welcome to another episode of the dark side of Mexico's history, where you'll hear things that you'll never be able to read in a government-sanctioned book, at least in any book sanctioned by the Mexican government. Today, I'm going to tell you about a character that was known in Mexico as Maximiliano de Habsburgo. This is a character whom all of the Mexicans have heard about. Maximilian was a good guy. But sadly, the official books that the government distributes in all of the public Mexican schools have not been fair with him. We have to begin with the place where Maximilian came from. Maximilian came from one of the biggest and most powerful European empires in his time, whose name was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. As Maximilian was not the firstborn of his royal family, he didn't have the right to be the emperor of his nation. That part belonged to his elder brother Franz Joseph, which is why, since they were little, Franz Joseph, knowing that he would have a lot of responsibilities when he grew up, was always very severe, very disciplined, and very serious. While on the other hand, Maximilian could afford to be very relaxed, very patient, very fun. But as we will see, the life of Maximilian was not as easy as one would think at first sight. Because one could think, oh, Maximilian was born being part of a royal family, so he never had economic problems in his life. But we always have problems. If they are not economic, they present themselves in another type. In the case of Maximilian of Habsburg, these problems manifested themselves in the form of gossip, which tormented him his whole life. Gossip that his mother had an affair out of wedlock with the son of Napoleon Bonaparte. And out of this relation, Maximilian had been born, which made him a bastard and an illegitimate son of the Empress of Austria. Boarding the subject of Maximilian's personal life, as Maximilian didn't have responsibilities, he spent his time traveling all around Europe, splurging the unending money of the Austrian Empire in alcohol, parties, having sexual affairs with pretty women. But being part of the Austrian royal family, Maximilian wasn't as free as he would have liked. Because after so many adventures, the point came when he fell in love with a German countess. But when the time came to get married with the love of his life, the Austrian Empire forbade him to carry on with such a union, because the Austrian royal family considered that such a woman was below his social status, even though this woman had a very high education and was an intelligent woman. After seeing Franz Joseph that his brother went through life without a direction and had a disorganized and messy life, Franz Joseph decided to give royal responsibilities to his brother to try to improve his life. So he made him general of the Austrian Royal Navy. And to everyone's surprise, Maximilian turned out to be great in his new position, because he was an honest man who was always willing to listen to the advice of his subordinates to take the best decisions. He was a responsible leader and very hardworking. So the time came when Maximilian's efforts paid off, because he was able to modernize the Royal Austrian Navy and improve it, turning the Austrian Navy into one of the best European navies of his time. Meanwhile, in Mexico, a lot of unending wars were taking place between two factions. On the one hand, Mexico had a faction called Los Conservadores, or the Conservatives in English, who were people that believed that Mexico was a newborn country, and because of this, it didn't have the ability to create its own laws. And so they wanted to keep the system that the Spaniards had imposed upon the country when the country was under their domain. The other faction that was fighting against the conservatives were Los Liberales, or the liberals. And what this group believed was that Mexico was different than Europe, and therefore it needed its own laws to address its unique needs and problems. The war between these two factions that could never see eye to eye did a lot of damage to the country, due to the fact that Mexico was drowning in debt, because both factions asked other countries for a lot of loans to keep sustaining the weapons and the food of their armies and be able to keep on fighting. Also, because of the instability provoked by the wars between these two, Mexico ended up having 50 governments in the short span of 40 years. And this is why the country could never get anything done, because the achievements of one government were undone by the next government. The drop that spilled the glass for the conservatives was when the first Indian president of the whole continent came to power in Mexico. The name of this native was Benito Juarez. Juarez saw that Mexico was very impoverished by so many wars and instability, and that is why he decided to stop the payment of the loans that foreign countries had made to Mexico, because his plan was to use that money for the recovery of Mexico, and so that the country could be strong and healthy. Seeing this, the foreign nations that Mexico owed money to, mainly England, France, and Spain, got very worried because they thought Mexico was never gonna pay them. So they sent part of their naval forces to the Mexican port of Veracruz to force Mexico to give them what was rightfully theirs. This worried Juarez a lot because he knew that Mexico was not in the condition to fight powerful foreign nations, and was in less condition to fight against three powerful foreign nations at the same time. So Juarez, very astutely, bargained with the invading foreign nations and was able to convince them that what was owed to them would be paid. So Spain and England withdrew their forces, while on the other hand France saw an opportunity to conquer Mexico and expand its power and resources, which is why the French army started incursioning into Mexican territory with the intention of getting all the way to the Mexican capital. And in the Mexican state of Puebla, a miracle happened for the Mexicans, because it was in this state that Juarez could form an army at the last minute, which wasn't even an army, because a lot of the people that formed this army weren't even professional soldiers. They were peasants and indigenous people. And to top it off, these people didn't have a professional training. They didn't have good weapons. They didn't even have enough ammunition to be able to beat the French. Aside from the fact that this alleged army was only made up of 2,000 men against 6,000 men that were well trained on the side of the French. And in spite of all of these disadvantages and adversities, this Mexican army, made up of legendary men, was able to defeat the French only with their sheer force of will. And it is because of this that every 5th of May, Mexicans celebrate this miracle. But if we see the bigger picture, this battle was not as important as Mexicans thought. Because in the end, the French won battle after battle until they achieved their goal, which was to get to the capital of the country. That not before sacrificing 50,000 lives on both sides, Mexican as well as French. And once the French took the capital, Juarez had no other choice but to flee to the north of the country, where he began to plan and wait for the opportunity to regain the country. At this point in time, the Monroe Doctrine was already in place. This doctrine was created by the Americans, supposedly to defend the whole continent against the European invaders. Basically, what this doctrine stated was that America was only for Americans, and any foreign nation that wanted to mess with any part of the continent was going to have to face the American army. So, you may ask yourselves, if this doctrine was already in place when the French invaded Mexico, why didn't the United States do anything to stop this French invasion? And the answer is simple. The United States was occupied with a civil war. I mean, the North was fighting against their brothers in the South. All due to the subject of slavery, because while the North wanted to free all of the slaves in the country, the South wanted to keep its slaves because its economy was heavily dependent on the work of slaves. Coming back to the subject of Mexico, in those times France had Napoleon III as its ruler, whose objectives aligned with the objectives of the conservatives in Mexico, because the Mexican conservatives wanted to have a European ruler, and they also wanted to kick out of power the gross Indian, who they considered Benito Juarez to be. And Napoleon III liked the idea of putting in power a European ruler who could be his puppet and do everything he wanted in Mexico. So, Napoleon III and the Mexican conservatives, who belong to the highest social status in Mexico, agreed that the ideal candidate to achieve these objectives would be Maximilian of Habsburg. So that is why they went to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and proposed Maximilian to become the Emperor of Mexico. Why did they propose him to be Emperor and not King of Mexico, you will ask yourselves? Let's remember that Mexico has the size of 14 European countries. And in those times in Europe, when a ruler had domain over a chunk of land bigger than 1, 2, 3, or 4 European countries, I mean over a very huge chunk of land, that ruler was considered an emperor, which is a position that is supposed to be above a king. But to the surprise of many, the first time they proposed Maximilian to become the Emperor of Mexico, he refused, because he argued that he didn't feel he had the experience or knowledge yet to rule in a wise way the country. But Napoleon III and the Mexican conservatives didn't give up, and they offered Maximilian of Habsburg for a second time the throne of Mexico. And this time Maximilian argued that he would only take the throne of Mexico if he saw in a poll that the Mexicans really wanted him to govern them, because he said that he was not willing to force anyone to be governed by someone they didn't want. So the Mexican conservatives went to work forging the polls, and they made Maximilian think that the Mexican people really wanted him to govern them. Also, his wife Charlotte pitched in to convince Maximilian, because she was an ambitious woman who wanted Maximilian to leave his mark on the world and not die under the shadow of his brother, the Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Which is why, after so much pressure, Maximilian agreed to take the throne of Mexico.